Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donohue. We've got a loaded show for you, setting the stage for the Saturday matchup between Maryland and the number 14 Penn State Nittany Lions. It is game week number 10 on the schedule. My colleagues at Lions247, Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen, will be with us in just a bit to break down what we saw from a Wednesday practice session at Penn State's practice fields, what that means carrying forward in terms of player availability. We'll break down what we believe are the top storylines of this game from a Penn State perspective, offer up our players to watch, and our predictions on a final score. But first, let's switch gears, get to know these Terps a little bit better, and we'll do that with longtime 24/7 Sports Maryland reporter Jeff Ermann. And Jeff, we appreciate you getting some time with us. We exchanged some questions. So we already have something up at Lions247.com with you providing some insight on the Terps, but this is really a chance to dive a little bit deeper over the course of these next 10, 15 minutes. So thanks for joining us for a segment.
Absolutely, Tyler. Thanks for having me.
We thought there was a chance in looking ahead to this November schedule that this was maybe a ranked opponent for Penn State. If Maryland was able to go on the road last week and come home with the win, end up 7-2, didn't happen that way, didn't come close. It was a 23-10 loss. Maryland scores its only touchdown in the final minute. Can you kind of summarize what went wrong in that matchup and maybe what you think about the Terps moving forward out of that one versus what you thought about them prior to that kickoff?
Yeah, kind of like I wrote in response to your questions on the site, everything went wrong. You know, it'll be hard to pinpoint one thing. Obviously, the weather didn't help there. As I mentioned, they're a passing team that likes to pass to set up the run. It was cold, wet, rainy. You know, the offense never got going. Wisconsin controlled the line of scrimmage on both sides. So it was really the first time this year Maryland's had one of those absolute clunkers where they never really had a chance from start to finish. You know, as I mentioned in response to your questions, I do think that they'll bounce back this week. I mean, I think they'll win, but I think that they'll perform well because you know, this team's a little different from some of the other Maryland teams in recent years. They're more experienced, a little more resilient. You know, a lot of guys on their last go around right now. So, you know, I think they'll recover and play well. But obviously, coming off a loss like that and you know, double-digit underdogs, I don't think too many people are picking them to win.
The record for Maryland in November over the last decade or so is pretty brutal, and they've had seasons that started off promising that end up average at best. What do you think about this November? The importance of it in year 4 for Mike Locksley, and what are the priorities? Obviously, you want to win every game. They've got Penn State, they've got number 2 Ohio State, they've got Rutgers left in the schedule. They've already got what you called that clunker. How important is this month, and what are the realistic expectations that they need to accomplish?
Well, it's important, you know, in a perfect world, this would be the year you finish strong and have a winning record in November, but the schedule doesn't really align for that. Obviously, the schedule was much easier during the first 2/3 of the year. You know, significant underdogs at Penn State, probably significantly bigger underdogs against Ohio State. So, you know, you would like to see, obviously, you need to win one of these final 3 with Rutgers and the finale being the most likely one. But, you know, anything beyond that, I think at this point is you know, playing with house money. Obviously, you know, they've been a good team. They've outperformed expectations. I think the preseason betting total was 5 wins, depending on when you got it. So they've already surpassed that. But you know, if you're not able to win one of these final 3, if you ended the season 6-6, you know, it would be a disappointment for sure, all things considered.
We mentioned the 6-2 start. One of those losses was a game where they lost by 7 on the road at Michigan. We've seen what Michigan can do on their home turf. They lost by 2 at home against Purdue, and I know that's one that you circle as kind of a pendulum swing for this program. But when it's gone right for the Terps thus far, what has gone right?
What's going right? I think, you know, the defense has been a little bit better than some might have expected. They're still not a shutdown defense by any stretch, but, you know, they're much better than they have been the past several years. The defense has been a major weakness for Maryland. So defense has been better. The offense probably hasn't been quite as explosive as you thought. You know, people talked a lot about Rakim Jarrett and Dante Demas as these star receivers, and that hasn't really panned out. And, you know, statistically, they've really spread the ball around to a ton of guys. The running game, you know, Roman Henby has been a revelation. Nobody had really, you know, unless you follow the team closely, nobody had really heard of him before this season. He won the job in camp as a redshirt freshman. He's been really good, averaging 6.2 yards a carry this season. So they found a future star there. They found another guy, Corey Dyches, at tight end, who's been really good. Arguably their best pass catcher. Probably he's made the most, I would say, big plays anyway. Statistically, I think he's exactly tied with Jarrett at like 396 yards. So, a lot of things have gone right. They haven't been as explosive as maybe you would have hoped. But again, overall, I think they've outperformed most expectations.
Tunga Vailoa has been around for a while now. It feels like he just transferred in, but this is year 3 as a starter. He played a lot of football for Maryland. He's going to have his name up very highly or at the top of a lot of records for the program. And we've seen him put up some big numbers against Penn State a couple of years ago in Beaver Stadium, last year down in College Park in a loss. Where is he in his progression? You mentioned the lack of explosiveness out of this passing game. How much is that is kind of correlated to his performance here? And obviously he's trying to put on a show for NFL scouts. His older brother is who he is. How do you think that kind of has come to fruition in his final year here with Maryland?
Well, actually, he could have one more year technically.
That's right. I got to get used to the COVID year, don't I?
Well, no, he redshirted as a freshman at Bama, so he could be back next year. In a month from now, that'll be more of a story. But he's gotten progressively better. I don't think you haven't seen some huge jump from him. I think he's gotten better each year. He's gotten better this year, and not, the interceptions, cutting down on those, which was an issue for him in past years. He's a pretty similar guy, but I think decision-wise, he's gotten a little better. That shows in his completion percentage. I haven't looked at it since the Wisconsin game. Heading into that game, I think he was 5th in the country at 72%. So he has gradually improved. And he's, even with the warts that he might have, he's the best quarterback they've had in decades, and he's scribbled his name all over the school record books. And if he were to come back for another year, he would own every passing record at Maryland.
And let's see. I mean, where is he health-wise? I know there were some issues in the last few weeks. Is he close to a guy who's fully capable? Is he someone that we're going to see out there and notice maybe he's restricted to some capacity? And just in terms of general health, are there some injury absences, some moving parts from a personnel standpoint that we should know heading into pregame?
Health-wise, they say he's fine. He started last game. He re-injured the MCL in his right knee and missed the Northwestern game a few weeks ago, but he should be fine, at least as far as they're letting on. Injury-wise, they had a bunch. They've gotten a little bit healthy since the bye week. Mason Lunsford, an offensive lineman's been out. He'll be out again, which is big because they have a kid named Colton Deere who they've slid into the starting center spot as a true freshman, which is obviously, it's hard to start anywhere on the line as a true freshman, especially at center, though, where you're making those calls and you're snapping the ball. And he had 4 or 5 bad snaps in the Wisconsin game, so that's something to watch. Otherwise, Rakim Jarrett had an injury, a leg injury, as they phrased it, lower leg injury last week. It sounds like he should be good to go, but you never really know for sure because Mike Locksley doesn't like to let on too much about the injury statuses.
Yeah, not surprised to hear that. Same deal on this campus as well. Kind of an underlying storyline. So an underlying storyline here is that Chop Robinson is quickly going to face a team that he was just a part of not too long ago, and it's a new part of college football. It's something that wouldn't have ever happened many years in the past. We talked a lot about it this week on the Penn State beat. Is it a topic of conversation down at Maryland? And kind of generally speaking, his departure after 1 year being kind of that cornerstone prospect that they try so hard to keep at home. How much is that sting and seeing the success on another Big Ten campus?
It's been brought up on and off. Obviously, anytime you lose a blue chip, one of your better recruits in recent years to obviously we can discuss whether they're rivals, but a bordering conference team, that's going to sting. I haven't really seen any discussion of it this week. Seems like he got off to a great start and people were talking about it a little bit and maybe has leveled off a little bit lately. So it hasn't been quite as much of a story, but it was definitely a blow for them, both perception wise and the fact that, pass rushing is not their strength. They could use some more speed on the end. So that was a hit for them. And I'm sure he'll be extra motivated this weekend. And I'm sure Maryland will be extra motivated not to let him, do anything.
I'll leave you with this one. Maryland comes to town and wins for a second time in a row in Beaver Stadium. If what happens, and then Maryland comes to town and loses a second straight game in Big Ten play, if what happens?
I think they win if they can establish the run, because Penn State's secondary is so good. You don't want to be forced to throw all day against that secondary, especially with Taulia, as we know, in some of these big games where he's had those interception issues. Defensively, they need to hold up much better against the run, avoid a lot of the penalties that have hurt them. They're the most penalized team in the Big Ten and one of the most penalized in the country. I think if, Penn State wins if they play their best game, and it's going to be hard for Maryland to do a lot about it. I think, especially on the road. Sean Clifford, I think, has been pretty solid. I don't know how the fans are feeling about him this week. That seems to fluctuate quite a bit.
It's week to week. It is definitely week to week around here. Yeah.
In their last trip there, they obviously gave him kind of a nightmarish afternoon. So if they can replicate that, that would be big. If they can't get the pass rush going, and they continue to commit the penalties and things like that, then it could be a long day.
Where are you leaning from a prediction standpoint here on a Thursday?
I think it's going to be a close game. I think the spread seems a little high to me. I don't see anything compelling me to pick Maryland for the upset. I think they're capable, but, if I had to make a pick, I'd say Penn State 31-24.
All right, Jeff Ermann does a great job covering Maryland for 247 Sports. Been doing it for a while. Happy to get him here on the podcast as these teams get to meet each other in Beaver Stadium on Saturday. Jeff, thanks a lot for the time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Jeff for his time and breaking down Maryland. And we'll get more into that matchup now from a Penn State perspective by bringing in Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen, colleagues at Lions247. And, of course, you hear from them every Thursday in this pregame edition of our weekly podcast. How you doing, fellas? We are off the practice field on Wednesday night as usual. And this was a key one to watch for in terms of availability. And we'll begin on the offensive line, because last week it was a scrambled situation. It turned out really well for them against Indiana, to that unit's credit, to Phil Troutwine's credit. Daniel, we've got a lot more questions to sort through in the next 48 hours here before kickoff, and certainly not trending in positive directions in parts of this offensive line.
Definitely. I think when you look at what we saw on the practice field last night, it's almost easier to say who was there and who was doing things, as opposed to going through the longer list of who we didn't see or who we saw that was limited. But we didn't see Olu Fashanu out there. I think he's kind of the biggest name right now that we're tracking after James Franklin's announcement that Landon Tangwall had season-ending surgery earlier this week. But it does look like we're going to see another kind of shuffled deck out there. We're going to see, I think, some interesting contingency plans in case there's any more injuries or anything along those lines. But we didn't see Olu out there. Didn't see Tangwall. Salim Wormley looked like a limited participant. Caden Wallace looked like a limited participant. And then you just kind of go from there. Hunter Norzad was there. Drew Shelton was there. Guys that we saw take a lot of reps last week were out there. So I think it's going to be a pretty similar line to what we saw last week against Indiana. And you do kind of wonder, was last week kind of a lightning in the bottle situation in terms of the opponent, circumstances with having that many young, inexperienced guys out there? Or is this something that Penn State can replicate? I think that we're going to learn a lot about the development of this line, the development of some of these younger players, and kind of how Phil Troutwine pushes these buttons and if he can get them to work again.
To this point, Landon Tangwall is the only guy in that bunch who's been ruled out for the remainder of this season. It was categorized, Olu Fashanu, as week to week by James Franklin on Tuesday. So make of that what you will. You just laid it out there. It sounds like there's going to be a need for some of these younger players to step up. And James Franklin talked about it after practice Wednesday, Mark. A big part of their growth as an offensive line is credited to the depth that they've established with those first-year players, which is really rare at this level of college football. And then today, we just had a conversation with Phil Troutwine less than 2 hours ago, and he spent a lot of time on Drew Shelton, of course, coming off start number 1, but also Venga Ioane, the guard who we could see potentially take a step forward in his career, get involved in a third game this Saturday against Maryland.
Yeah, sometimes it's difficult to judge why we're seeing certain players at practice. And I wonder with the whole Sal Wormley thing, we saw Venga in there at his position. And I wonder if that was more getting Venga extra reps because he's not had that many, or was it protecting Sal, or was it some combination of the two? But how fortunate are they to have brought in 2 offensive linemen who are able to contribute this early? I mean, Phil Troutwine actually had a pretty funny story saying, just recently, he said, Drew Shelton wasn't here in the spring. I thought he was here in the spring, but no, he arrived in June. I mean, and for a guy to come in and play at that left tackle spot and play well, I think speaks to how good he is. But you think about it, both of those guys arrived in the summer. Venga actually arrived even later, and to have one of those guys in a class that could come in and make an impact is rare. To have 2 of them, I think is, that's kind of special. I think they have some wiggle room with Venga here. You know the numbers better than I do. I didn't take a look at the red shirt report yet. I'm sorry. But I know they want to get him in there just to have him ready just in case. So having those two guys ready to go, I think Shelton, obviously, I'll go back to what I said earlier. I don't see if he's that advanced, and Troutwine was talking him up even more today. I just don't see that it makes any sense to even attempt to redshirt him at this point, even if Olu comes back, just because if something's re-aggravated with Olu, you want to have this guy ready to go and get him a bunch of reps. So lucky to have 2 freshmen, and both of them doing a good job so far.
Franklin mentioned on Wednesday night may not be feasible to apply that red shirt to Drew Shelton moving forward. So we'll see. This Saturday, that would be number 4 for Shelton. That would mean the next snap after this Saturday would burn his red shirt. Like you mentioned, Venga has a little more wiggle room. He's at 2 games at this stage of his freshman season. And it's not just those 2 guys that they've gotten instant addition impact from. This 2022 influx of offensive linemen, you've got Malik McNeil, who's a big 6'7" statue of clay to work on here for the next 2 or 3 years and figure out what you've got in him. But 4 guys have shown up on campus and played significant football now for you. It's those 2 freshmen, and maybe not significant to this point for Venga, but I think it will be by the time we get through the next few games. And then you've got JB Nelson, who played 70-plus snaps last week, was needed through the entirety in both guard positions. And you've got Hunter Norzad, who came to campus in May. The only guy who was actually here for spring ball, getting those 15 practices under his belt, was JB Nelson. And we've talked a lot in the past about what the transfer portal has done and Penn State's ability to bring players in and make an impact. And they've had a pretty high hit rate there. Focusing on the offensive line in this situation, Daniel, I mean, it has been a major kind of a bailout for them. Otherwise, you look at what they'd be working with, and developmentally, they face some issues, working guys up their own pipeline within the roster.
Penn State is really fortunate when you look at especially that class of 2020. The 5 guys who are on the offensive line who are brought in there. Olu is the only one who has played really steady reps and made steady contributions from that group. And I think that's where Hunter Norzad comes in. That's where a JB Nelson comes in, via Lackawanna. I think the thing that really helped with those guys is the previous experience that they had. Hunter Norzad is a 5th-year senior. He was in the Ivy League for a long time. Obviously, his career was interrupted by COVID, given that the Ivy League canceled its season in 2020. So it hasn't been a completely linear path for him. But I think that when you bring in guys from the transfer portal on the offensive line, theoretically, you should bring them in with a higher floor, even from the JUCO ranks like JB Nelson. And I think that's something that really paid off for Penn State this season. It is really hard to contribute as a freshman along the offensive line. I think that Penn State has 2 hits right now in Drew Shelton and Venga Ioane. But the fact that you can rely on guys who are a little bit older, a little bit more developed, even if there is kind of technically or maybe mentally in terms of techniques or in terms of knowing a playbook or things like that, there's development that needs to happen. You're at least not operating from a physical disadvantage. There's a difference between trotting out a 22-year-old and an 18-year-old in a dire situation when it comes to depth. So I think Penn State did a good job of identifying, true freshmen in that class of 2022 to bring in, and then supplementing it with a junior college player and a transfer portal veteran, because I think that they knew that after last season that they really needed to bolster that depth. They needed an influx of talent there, and they've really addressed it. When you factor in Hunter Norzad coming back next year, there's going to be a lot of talent on this roster, a lot of talent in the trenches. And as this year has shown, you might need all of it.
And it's not easy to do on the offensive line. We've seen, I mean, Eric Wilson started 12 games last season, but, I don't think he's starting on this offensive line. I don't think he's seen a lot of opportunities on this offensive line. And then, Anthony Wiggin comes in from Lackawanna, ultimately ends up taking a step down the ladder out of Power 5 football to finish his career. So it's not easy to do. They've done a slam dunk with it in 2022. That involves evaluation. That involves what Phil Troutwine has done with the unit since they got to campus. And we have a lot on that conversation with Troutwine at Lions247.com. So check that out. A bunch of the freshmen about the offensive line depth. And although he's sidelined in the moment, Olu Fashanu and his NFL draft stock, Phil was not shy about breaking that down and why he thinks Olu is so appealing to pro scouts at this point early on in his career. Let's shift focus to defense, where the glaring absence on the practice field Wednesday was Curtis Jacobs. He leads all linebackers in tackles. He's second on the team in that category. A guy that has that ability to create a stir and change momentum. We're not sure if we'll see him on this Saturday against his home state team, the Maryland Terrapins. But we do know he was out early last week, did not come back, and we didn't see him on the practice field. And generally speaking, Mark, that's not a good trend at this stage of the game week.
Yeah, I mean, I think it puts a lot of pressure on Abdul Carter, who to this point, I mean, has played extremely well, but they haven't absolutely needed him. And in this game, they are going to need him to step up if Jacobs isn't able to play. I also think it impacts what's going to happen over at that Sam position. I mean, honestly, I think it's been a bit of a tough year for Jonathan Sutherland over there, but you really have to play him, or do you look at a Dom DeLuca? I mean, I'm not sure what you do over at that spot, because what they have been doing is moving Curtis Jacobs over there and putting Abdul Carter in at the will position. And I think with a quarterback like they're going to face this week, who, when healthy, is very accurate, we've seen what those quarterbacks do to Penn State, especially in that short passing game. And, Curtis Jacobs, I don't think anybody's going to say that his, strength is pass coverage, but in terms of who they have out there, he's played a lot of football. He played a lot of that Sam position last year. He was in space a lot. So he's a guy who can do those things for you. And if you take him out of the mix, again, I think, you're going to be leaning heavily on Jonathan Sutherland, who's not had a great year, and Abdul Carter, a true freshman who has a gigantic upside, but is going to have to learn really quickly. And then obviously at middle linebacker, looks like Tyler Elsdon will be okay. I thought it was good that Kobe King, when he had an opportunity to see more snaps last week, really flashed. But again, I don't know both of those guys. I really wonder about their ability to cover, tight ends, running backs, kind of in space. We've seen some opponents running wide open in those areas underneath. And I think all of those linebackers, if Curtis Jacobs is unable to go, are really going to have to step it up in that department.
Elsdon was a participant at practice on Wednesday. Good to see, as he got very little work on Saturday after an exit. Just a couple other veterans checking in on their status. Kevon Lee, did not see him at practice again. It's been a while since we've seen him at practice. He has not played since the Michigan matchup on October 15th. Tyler Warren was absent. He's played a cumulative less than 20 snaps the last couple games, so you've got to question what's happening there. It's been Theo Johnson, Brenton Strange taking over at tight end. If they need to work a third guy in, if Warren's not there, Khalil Dinkins is the name to know. And then Marquise Wilson, he's quietly been that fourth cornerback in a really talented position group, absent the last couple matchups. He was a participant at practice. So we've got a lot to look forward. As always, before this matchup, we'll be doing that with our binoculars from the Beaver Stadium press box. Be sure to follow our coverage on Saturday prior to kickoff. 2 hours, hour and a half. We're there and we're following along the action to see what happens next. Mark, when we talk about that linebacker unit, the name that I wanted to quickly bring up is Keon Wiley, because he's the freshman out of Philadelphia. He's been a scout team stalwart through most of the season, but he was not in a scout team uniform this past practice view. And that stood out to me. He was wearing his number 32, which he has on the Penn State roster. There's no linebacker across the field this week that wears number 32. I had to double check that. So he's another name to throw in there and consider in the box. But I think you mentioned Kobe King. he has an opportunity here in November, I think, to really set himself up going into the offseason, because Daniel and I talked about it last show. This is a competition that has gone unresolved, although it is Tyler Elsdon's show for the most part this season. Feels like it's an unresolved situation, and you probably throw Abdul Carter into the conversation too. Big moment here, it feels like, for Kobe King, and he got off to a good start last week.
Yeah, I mean, I just think all those young linebackers, again, against this opponent, it's if you lose a Curtis Jacobs, if he's not able to play, everybody has to step up. In terms of Kobe King, I mean, I've liked what I've seen of him for most of the season. I'm not sure why Elsdon has been the guy who has kind of gotten the vast majority of the snaps heading into last week's game. I suppose it's probably because at that Mike linebacker position, you're making all the calls, and I'm guessing maybe Elsdon is a little bit better at making those calls at this point of his career. But again, I liked what we saw out of Kobe King, and I think the more snaps that he gets, the more comfortable he can become kind of in that role as the quarterback of the defense, so to speak. With regard to Wiley, I think he only played on special teams out at Indiana. But I wonder where he would ideally fit in, because, I don't think right now that I think they initially projected him as a Mike, but I don't know that you need him at that position now. So it would almost seem to make more sense. Again, we're operating as if Curtis Jacobs isn't going to play. We don't know that for sure, but that's kind of the sense that we're getting. Do you see Wiley, over at that Sam position, which, typically that's been an area where with young linebackers, they've been able to introduce them into that spot before moving them to a more complicated spot.
They've cross-trained Wiley. I think it's worth pointing out he's 206 pounds per the roster, and he looks like that. He's actually, scout teamed a safety during the season at times. So, certainly some questions about his ability to hold up in the box. I think we're probably looking at a situation where if he plays this week, you're looking at maybe a maximum of a dozen snaps if things go according to plan for you. But it's one of those things to file away, another young member of this roster, and we've seen a lot of them stepping up. Speaking of new members of this roster, Daniel, you wrote a story today about Chop Robinson and this very rare opportunity. I mean, it's what, a matter of 7 months ago that he's with this team, and they're preparing for spring ball, and a lot of Maryland fans think he's going to be part of the plan and heading up to Beaver Stadium and chasing around Sean Clifford. And yet here he is. The script is flipped, and he's one of the more feared members of a Penn State defense that Maryland's going to deal with. What do you make of this situation?
I mean, on Saturday, it will have been 1 year and 6 days since Chop Robinson was chasing around Sean Clifford as a Maryland Terrapin last year at Maryland Stadium. James Franklin acknowledged it, that it's kind of when he was asked about it on Wednesday night, that it's a different game now when it comes to the transfer portal, when it comes to being eligible immediately. In the past, it was always the thing where you would hear about someone entering the transfer or someone with their intent to transfer, and then shortly after the list would come out of the schools that they were restricted from transferring. And typically that would be, like the schools in the conference plus, future opponents out of conference for the next, X number of years. That was just kind of how, how business was done. But
it's insane to think about now. It's insane to think about now. I completely forgot about that. And that was what, 12 years ago?
Oh yeah. I mean, I was, to bring this back to Maryland, I was thinking this morning about, I've talked about him before, but Danny O'Brien, when he was transferring out of Maryland in early 2012, he took a visit to Penn State. But his list of restrictions was something like the ACC schools, Maryland's future opponents for the next X years, and then, Vanderbilt, where his former offensive coordinator, James Franklin, had gone. And I've looked up the story today, and eventually Maryland relented and got rid of all the restrictions for him. And, he ended up at Wisconsin. So it is, in the past decade, things have changed so much. I do think that it on the aggregate, it's for the better when it comes to these players and their freedom to move around a bit to find the best situation for them. I think that it's one of those things too, that everything evens out in the end. You see the bonkers number of guys in the transfer portal. Over time, I think that things will settle down and, everyone adjusts. I mean, college football has been through so much and it's not dead yet. So I think that it can get through this. But yeah, I mean, going back to Chop Robinson, he's someone who came in at a position where there's a lot of uncertainty there in the spring, especially after Zariah Fisher went down with his season-ending injury. Jesse Luketa was gone. Arnold Ebiketie was gone. Adisa Isaac was coming off a torn Achilles. Smith Vilbert had flashed in the Outback Bowl, but you still didn't quite know what you had there. You knew Denai Dennis Sutton was coming in as a very highly regarded player, but that's still relying on a freshman, even if it's a 5-star. So there are a lot of questions there. And, Chop Robinson, I think, was a very good piece to not only boost the depth there, but to raise the level of the group. He's still adjusting and coming in from being an outside linebacker at Maryland to being more of a traditional 4-3 defensive end at Penn State. And I think either Adisa Isaac or Devon Elise said this week that, once he continues to get the hang of it, once he, grows into it more, he has the chance to be a pretty dangerous player. So it's going to be interesting to see him. I got him for a minute after the Indiana game last week. He was made available to us, and I snuck in the question about if there's any extra motivation for him for this game or what he thought about it, and he deferred. He said that he was excited, but he was just focused on enjoying that win out in Bloomington. But both Adisa Isaac and Devon Elise and even James Franklin said that there's probably some excitement there for Chop Robinson to go up against his former teammates and do it in a different uniform, one that's pretty familiar to his teammates.
Chop last week, 2 tackles for loss and a sack, and he only played about 20 snaps. So a bit of an opportunity for some rest over the course of that matchup after he played a lot of football against Ohio State. And he'll be on the hunt against this Maryland team. And when you look at this matchup, Mark, it is one that Penn State has historically dominated. 41 wins, 3 losses, 1 tie along the way. There was a 3-game stretch from 2017 through 2019 where Penn State outscores the Terrapins 163-6. It was just a party every time. They put that blackout to bed early on in 2019, back in Sean Clifford's first ever Big Ten start. But here we are. And one thing that is certainly lingering, I think you can tell conversations with players, and it's just something that they want to exercise, is a demon from 2020. What happened here in Beaver Stadium? That was a really egg on the face moment, Mark, because 34-17, I think it was that night, wasn't even indicative of the margin of the performance. This one feels a little bit more personal to me for a team that prides itself on the 1-0 mantra.
Yeah, I also, in our predictions, Goon always harkens back. It really bugged him in 2014 when Maryland captains refused to shake hands. And I will bet you that that's still in. And I know that we're talking about all different people involved there, but I think that still probably sticks in Franklin's craw. I don't think he would admit it. But that, and that whole 2020 season, I think some opponents really relished in, you go back to the Indiana game that year where they celebrated like they had won a national title, which it was a big win and they should have. And then, Maryland gets up and really stomps. I mean, the final score wasn't even indicative of how bad that beatdown was. So, I'm sure that there were players who were involved in that game and coaches who were involved in that game who are going to be motivated. And, I also think that you look at what Maryland went through last week at Wisconsin and the way that game kind of unfolded in sort of ugly fashion. And you look at a quarterback who's banged up. And, I'm kind of hinting to where I'll go with my, score prediction here. But I just think you're going to see a motivated Penn State team. Coming out of that Ohio State game, there were legit questions over how that team would bounce back. It's one thing to lose to Michigan, and then you still have that carrot of Ohio State sitting there. It's another thing to be up with 9 minutes to go against Ohio State and then somehow – not only lose, but, just lose in ridiculous fashion. But, the 10-win season, the possibility of a 10-win season, the possibility of a New Year's Six Bowl, it's there for them. And I think added in that motivation. And they're, Penn State won't call this a rivalry game, but it's as close to a rivalry, regionally as they probably have, right? I mean, when you talk about a team that Penn State played for years and years and years, even before getting into Big Ten, and then didn't see them for a long time, and then Maryland gets in the Big Ten, You obviously have the whole Loxley Franklin thing involved. So I'm not saying it's a great rivalry, but I do think there are some elements of a rivalry here on both sides. And I think that makes it fun. It should, hopefully both teams are a little bit more amped for this one.
Historically, there's also been elements of a hammer and a nail in this matchup. And of late, in the last decade, certainly they've given Franklin's Penn State squad some issues. And in this matchup, when we look at how that could happen again, Daniel, what stands out to you? If Maryland has its opportunity to seize, where is it on the field?
I think that offense has to bounce back. I think that's really the only way that Maryland can really compete with Penn State. I think you look at how the Penn State offense has played the past couple of weeks. They looked good at Indiana. I thought for the most part they looked good against Ohio State. And then going back to Minnesota the week before that, I think even with those Sean Clifford mistakes that are sprinkled in there, I think that the Penn State offense is playing at a level where if you want to beat Penn State, you got to score some points. So I think that Maryland has the talent to do it. Last time Rakim Jarrett was at Beaver Stadium, he was running wild through the secondary. When I talked to him at Big Ten Media Day back in July, he said that he kind of viewed that game as his breakout on the college stage. And I think he said he should have had one more touchdown, but he got caught, I think, from behind. So I think that those guys are going to be motivated. They're really balanced, 6 guys with at least 20 catches. They have some interesting matchups. They have that 6'2", 220-pound tight end who's been a big play threat. Jacob Copeland, the transfer from Florida, has been a big play threat. And then you go back to Roman Hemby, the running back, 6.2 yards per carry, had a big game against Northwestern. I think that he's someone that can break off a big run. So I think that's kind of Maryland's key to be in this, is to get some of those big plays, to let those athletes that Mike Loxley has recruited, like Rakim Jarrett, to come in and let them make big plays. I think Jayshon Jones is another guy at wide receiver who, in his first career game ever, ran for a touchdown, caught a touchdown, and threw a touchdown. So they've got these guys that can do a lot of different things, make big plays. And I think those guys really do need to show up and make that happen if Maryland wants to make this a game, wants to beat Penn State.
A couple of weeks ago, Penn State took on one of the top quarterbacks in the country, maybe a guy who's going to win the Heisman Trophy. That's been bookended, though, by really 2 bottom-out situations at the quarterback spot. I mean, Minnesota had to turn to 2 different guys who weren't ready for that situation, and they were leaning heavily on their running game in that matchup, and it didn't work out well for them. And then last week, of course, the wind, the 3 different backups for Indiana, that didn't work out well for them. This is a different kind of test for Manny Diaz. You just laid out why. Mark, what are you looking for from this defensive unit? Because, quite frankly, outside of that Ohio State matchup, those other couple of matchups, we haven't really gotten to see them take on a full arsenal of an offensive attack.
Yeah, I think pressure, especially with the potentially hobbled quarterback. I know that may sound, mean or cruel, but listen, if he's not operating at 100%, get after him. I mean, that's one thing that in that Indiana game that I really liked, is that when they got in trouble, they just let loose. And I think you take your chances. If somebody's going to beat you deep, great. But unleash, blitz, unleash your defensive ends, and get as much pressure on this quarterback as you can. Because I think he's the one guy that if we see it last week, if he's not clicking, that offense is in trouble. So get after him. And, you play clean, but you try to get some solid hits in and keep him on his toes. And I think that is the absolute key for this team in this game, because I think, Daniel mentioned it offensively, Mike Yursich has his group clicking, and you look at the number of points Penn State scored against Ohio State, despite the 4 turnovers from Clifford. I mean, it's kind of crazy. So I think Penn State's going to score. It's going to be a matter of, defending against a very talented quarterback.
And he's put up some big numbers against this team. He had 370-plus yards last year. Had a costly interception at the end of the game, though, that Jair Brown took back for a touchdown. And that visit here to Beaver Stadium, 280 and 3 touchdowns without an interception. You look at what he's been able to accomplish, and getting him off platform. they're missing some components too. We spent a lot of time on this show breaking down Penn State's offensive line. They're turning to freshmen. They're turning to backups in key spots on their offensive line. We've already talked about the waves of depth this Nittany Lions defense has been able to implement. And for whatever reason, they haven't been hit hard by injury bug. And that has really been huge because they go real deep across that defensive line. Last week, 5 sacks against an Indiana offensive front that is really bad. And then all of October, 2 sacks for the entire defensive line. So you want to see that kind of trajectory sustained. This isn't going to be the Hoosiers offensive front, but it certainly isn't going to be one of the premier offensive lines in the Big Ten, especially the way it's coming into this matchup from an injury standpoint. So I think would love to see some of that dominance up front. The interior group, that rush was big last week. Keziah Izzard, Devon Illies both got sacks. I think Zane Durant was able to apply some pressure. That's an aspect of this defensive line that I think has been missing a little bit in some key moments. Haven't seen that interior penetration. I think if they can carry that over at Indiana, bring that into this matchup, and then free things up for the guys on the edge, that presents some issues for Maryland, and that could get their quarterback to fall into a trap, which he's done before in putting the ball in a bad spot and setting the stage for a big night for this secondary. So, Daniel, the shredding of this Penn State defense that we've seen from Tagovailoa at times is kind of comparable to what Sean Clifford has done against Maryland as a quarterback. I mean, he's got 3 career wins where he's thrown for 300 yards in that game. 2 of them are against the Terps. What do you think about the focus on number 14 and the lack of focus that we in the media have placed on him this week? I mean, we're almost 40 minutes into this podcast, if not more. The first time we're getting to Mr. Clifford.
Yeah, I don't think Sean Clifford came up in James Franklin's both of his availabilities this week. He got a question about Christian Veillere on Tuesday, but that was the only time the quarterbacks were talked about with James Franklin. So it's one of those things where winning cures a lot, especially when it's for the quarterback. But I think Sean Clifford's going to have a big game. He's been able to take advantage of this secondary before in his career. And I think that you look at how Parker Washington has come along. Mitchell Tinsley is continuing to make some big catches in some key points. I think that Tinsley is someone who could be in for a big game. But I think one thing that we've learned about Sean Clifford is that even if he makes that first quarter mistake, he's very resilient. We've seen him come back from it against Minnesota, last week against Indiana. It's not perfect. It's not pretty. We know what it looks like and what it is, but he's been able to get the job done at a couple different points this year. And I think that Saturday will be another occasion of that. You look at the Maryland defense and they don't really have a big time pass rusher. They're not a team that seems to really get to the quarterback and bring him down with a lot of regularity. So I think that Clifford, even with a potentially patchwork offensive line in front of him, I think he should have some time and he'll have the ability to make some decisions. Maryland has played a couple shootouts this year. They had that game again. They had a weird Saturday night non-con game against SMU in College Park that featured some action through the air. They're susceptible to giving up some points here and there. So I think that Clifford should be in for a pretty big game. And I don't know if you want me to give my bold prediction now or if I should save that for predictions, but it does involve Sean Clifford.
Why don't you stash that? Because we'll keep a huge segment of our audience on with us. They probably would have left if you gave that away just now. So let's keep them on board. Let's get to our predictions. And Mark, let's start with you. Actually, sorry, that my own joke got me screwed up there. Mark, let's start with you on our players to watch. We bounced around a bunch of topics here. Let's get to players offensively, defensively. Who you focused in on the Nittany Lions side?
Yeah, I'm looking at Brenton Strange. He had 4 touchdowns through Penn State's first 4 games, has not had a touchdown since, if my math is correct. Had a couple of really nice catches against Indiana. I think you'll see more focus on Theo Johnson defensively just because of the way he's kind of been more of a target in recent weeks. And I look for Brenton Strange to come through and have a big game. And then over on defense, I am going to go with Abdul Carter. Double-digit tackles, maybe a sack. He's a sort of athlete that you could really let loose in this game. Could he make a mistake or two? Yes, but I'm looking for him to have a big game couple tackles for losses, maybe a sack, double digits in tackles overall.
All right, what do you got for us, Daniel?
On the offensive side of the ball, I'm going to go with Mitchell Tinsley. Like I just mentioned, I think Sean Clifford should be able to make some things happen. And then a little subplot that I wrote about over the summer. Tinsley and Maryland cornerback Jacorian Bennett were teammates at Hutchinson Community College out in Kansas when they both came out of high school. Bennett said that they would get up early at 6 a.m. every day, and the two of them would go out and work out. So both of them have the book on how to beat each other. So I think that'll be a little fun, entertaining, a little bit more human subplot. But I do like what Tinsley has done, and I feel like he's kind of due. You know, Parker Washington came out and had that big game that we were all kind of waiting for. Tinsley hasn't really had that type of game yet. He's been very solid. He's been able to get into the end zone, but he hasn't put up those numbers that when you go through his game log where you're just like, oh, wow, he really did it this game. Defensively, I'm going to stay in the linebacker core and go with Kobe King. It does seem like Tyler Elsdon is on track to play, but given how Kobe King played last week and given that we're not quite sure what Tyler Elsdon might be dealing with, I think that there's a good chance that we'll see him. And I want to see if he can build on that performance from last week. Roman Hemby averages 83 yards per game for Maryland. When you think about this Maryland team and the weapons that they have and how they've played in the past, it's almost a little surprising to look at the numbers. With Tunga Vailoa only having 14 touchdowns to 6 interceptions, even though he's missed some time. And then you look at Roman Hemby with 7 touchdowns on the ground and who's had some really, really big games for them. I think he's been over 100 yards 4 times maybe. So I think that Kobe King will be important in the run game, especially if that Penn State defensive line keeps playing at a high level. If you've got PJ Mustipher and Keziah Izzard taking up guys to make some space at the second level, I think we could see Kobe King make some big plays in the running game.
Circling back to what you said on Tinsley, his most productive game to date remains the season opener, 7 catches, 84 yards, and a touchdown at Purdue. He had a couple third down catches on Penn State's first touchdown of the first touchdown drive of the game last Saturday. My players of the game, I'm going with the guy who scored 5 touchdowns the last couple of weeks. Kaytron Allen led the team in receiving yards and rushing yards last week. Very fascinated by his ascension. I mean, we knew it was never going to be the Nick Singleton show and he was going to be an afterthought, but I think we thought at best that he would be kind of that second option, that by the time we were into this season, every fan would know Nick Singleton, and maybe many of them would know Kaytron Allen. They're both at the forefront. They're both doing a great job of sharing that load. J1 Siders getting them both involved on a consistent basis. There's no one else with the scholarship and running back room to play right now, so that helps. But I'm going to go with Kaytron Allen going plus 100 yards for the first time against a Big Ten opponent in his career. I think he becomes the first Nittany Lion to get to double-digit touchdowns on the season. Nick Singleton's not far behind him. And then defensively, sign me up for Joey Porter Jr. It's been kind of a quiet stretch for him. Ohio State, the targets were very limited. The couple weeks that we saw Minnesota, Indiana, quarterback wasn't able to accomplish much against anybody, wasn't willing to test a lot of these guys. It was a conservative approach. And you go back even to Michigan. They were able to really shut their passing game down because they built such a big lead, ran for 400 yards. And before the bye week, it was Northwestern, which didn't have much of a passing game to speak of. So to me, it feels like Joey Porter Jr. is going to face the quarterback who's going to be willing to test him on occasion, especially if the Terps fall behind in this game. And that means he could rise up to the spot and remind everybody a little bit, pad some of those stats, which have kind of been, kind of stayed where they were for the last few weeks. I think this is a nice stage set for Joey Porter Jr. to maybe slam the door shut on a Maryland drive or two and just remind folks that he is a premier talent at that position. Prediction time, guys. Mark, we'll go back to you here. What do you got for a score, and what is the bold aspect of your prediction for this one?
I will go bold first. I think Penn State's going to return a kick for a touchdown.
Wow.
Could be a punt, could be a kickoff, could be a block kick. If you're asking me to be specific, I think Nick Singleton pops a kickoff return for a touchdown. He has been so close on runs and a couple of these kickoffs that I think he finally finds that seam and bursts through. And so you're asking for bold. I'm giving you bold. Special teams touchdown, kick return touchdown, but I will go specifically with Nick Singleton. In terms of score, I go back to what I said. I just think that the Penn State offense is really clicking under Mike Yurcich. It's been good to see it finally develop a level of consistency aside from the turnovers, but we're kind of seeing what the identity is. Moving the ball around, having a quarterback who generally is making good decisions. And I just think with a banged-up quarterback on the other side, I think he's still dealing with a knee injury. I don't know that they're going to be able to score enough points to keep up. So I'm going Penn State 35, Maryland 20.
All right, what do you got, Daniel?
For bold prediction, I teased it a little bit. I think we're going to see a season high in yardage from Sean Clifford. He's averaged 367 yards per game in his previous starts against Maryland. His season high is 371 against Ohio State 2 weeks ago. I think that fits into what I thought about Mitchell Tinsley having a big game. So I'm going to put it on the quarterback's shoulders. We didn't talk about him all week, but I think we'll be talking about him when we get to Saturday evening. As for the score, I think last week, when you look at how Maryland played, I think that's an anomaly for them. I think that they're too talented. They have too many playmakers, on that offense to have a duplicate performance. They're also playing a Wisconsin team that's a little rejuvenated and I think is really, really playing for Jim Leonhard to get that full-time job. So I think Maryland will make it interesting early, but I think that overall, I think Penn State is just a stronger program than Maryland, has a deeper roster. I was going through some numbers since Maryland joined the Big Ten in 2014. Maryland is 6-25 in November. If you go back to the start of 2011, which was when Randy Edsall took over, Maryland is 8-35 in November games. I think that just kind of speaks to that program just not being at the level where at this point in the season, it hasn't been able to stand up to attrition. It doesn't quite have the same depth as maybe a Penn State or these other teams in the Big Ten East. So I think that there's a real gap there. And over the course of Saturday, that gap will become a little bit more clear. Maryland keeps it interesting early, hits on a couple of those big plays, but we get a couple of Tagovailoa mistakes that Penn State's able to take advantage of. Maybe it'll be similar to last year where Jair Brown, some sort of defensive touchdown gives that final breathing room, but I have Penn State 38, Maryland 24.
Yeah, and I think just playing off of what you just said, the concern from a Maryland perspective is the guys in this locker room have lived it before. The fan base has lived it before. Is it, oh, no, here we go again, a November slide that sees us go from 6-2 to 6-6 or something like that, or where you're reliant upon a Rutgers win in that last game to get that 7th win. They've got Penn State this week, Ohio State next week, and they just came off from a very demoralizing loss. And there's big question marks for how Mike Locksley's going to fire up this unit, have them ready to come up to play in Beaver Stadium against a team that looked very motivated last week when they had their moment like this. So there's part of me that wonders if the bottom falls out for Maryland, if things go bad for them early in this game. We've seen it happen to them before in this building. But I'm going to go more of a narrow margin, 14 points like you, 34-20. I think Penn State wins it. I do think they'll be able to find balance again offensively. I mentioned Katron Allen, an effective day. I think certainly you'll get plenty of opportunities for Nick Singleton to go off as well. And Sean Clifford goes plus 300 yards for once again against this Maryland team. The thing for me here is I think defensively they'll come up with more plays over the course of this game than will the Terps defense, and they'll win the turnover battle. And my bold prediction plays into that. For a second straight year, a red zone interception seals the victory. And I'll go double bold here since I already brought him up. I'll say Joey Porter is the guy who personally says, no, sir, and closes that opportunity for Maryland. I don't know if he'll race it back like Jair Brown did last year, but I think that'll shut the door in their face, get Penn State to 8-2 with a trip to Rutgers on the horizon. That's going to do it here. We've all got Penn State winning. We've all got them improving to 8-2 on the season. Big thanks to Mark and Daniel, as always, for hopping on a Thursday. We'll all be in the Beaver Stadium press box on Saturday. Join us before kickoff at Lions247.com as we keep an eye on the offensive line, on the linebackers, on what it looks like is shaping up for the starting unit for the Nittany Lions. We will be there early. We'll be reporting to you. Follow our coverage throughout the day and after the game. There's also recruits on campus. Tyler Calvaruso has you covered at Lions247.com as that list continues to come together. We'll be with you again on on Saturday with our post-game podcast. For now, I'm Tyler Donohue. On behalf of everyone here stepping aside, this has been the Lions 247 Podcast.